Well, it's a pleasure for me to introduce to the BYU community a good friend of mine and a scholar for whom I hold a lot of respect, with whom I worked side by side, literally almost, for 4 years in southern Germany. Roger D. Kangas is now a professor of Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He currently works with programs on terrorism and transnational threats, as well as South and Central Asia. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and has written numerous articles and book chapters on Central Asian politics and security. His latest work is a book that's called Playing Solitaire, Competing National Security Strategies in Central Asia. From 1999 to 2007, he was professor of Central Asian Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. Prior to that, he was deputy director of the Central Asian Institute at the Polichnitsky School of Advanced International Studies and fellow of Johns Hopkins University Foreign Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He was also Central Asian course coordinator at the Foreign Service Institute, U.S. Department of State. He's been a research analyst on Central Asian affairs at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague in the Czech Republic, and an assistant professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. During the past 15 years, Dr. Kangas has been an advisor or has run programs for numerous U.S. government agencies on issues related to Central Asia and South Asia, Russia, and the Southern Caucasus. He received a BA from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a PhD in political science from Indiana University. And I'll turn the time to Dr. Kangas.
And it is a pleasure to be here. Living in the Washington, D.C. area, I miss my mountains, and it's nice to see some again as the clouds parted. This talk, oh goodness, we have so little time. I could easily take us till about 9 o'clock tonight, but I know you have other things to do. There's a clock back there. I have my handy stopwatch here to remind me of how we're doing, in part because, at least my intention, is to raise a number of the issues on the question of Eurasian energy security. But obviously, if there are specific things, directions you'd like to go in, I'm more than happy and look forward to answering questions and discussing this afterwards. The task is pretty simple today. Simple at least in terms of what at least I'm trying to do, which is to understand from the Russian perspective, to understand from the perspective of the former Soviet states how energy security plays in their thinking and perhaps at some level what it means for us and what it means for the rest of the world. All too often as we've negotiated with them, we've met with disaster. U.S.-Russian relations have hit some pretty low points, and this has actually gone on since 1991. I don't blame one administration. I don't blame one individual. It has been a continual roller coaster, and part of this, from the Russian view, is we don't respect them. We don't understand them on the terms that they would like to work with us and they would like to engage in the international security. But here's where that small introduction addresses the question of energy. You see, in the old days, during the Cold War, our relationship was based in many ways on military parity or perhaps superiority in certain aspects, conventional weapons or nuclear weapons. We were seen as ideological rivals. That vanishes in 1991, and what's next? Well, do we see them as a country in need of assistance? Do we see the region as really a humanitarian crisis? When I first went to the Soviet Union to live as a student, it was in 1986. It was the year of Chernobyl, a very interesting year to be in the country, to say the least. And at the time, there was a strong sense of pride. When I returned in 1991-92, of course, things were much different. To use the phrase, a basket case is probably a compliment, both in Russia and then when I went down south to Uzbekistan. And so from this point onward, the goal is how can we regain our stature? Well, Russia's found it. And of course, it's in the realm of energy. Because if we're thinking in terms of what can replace the Red Army, it's quite frankly the gas spigot. It's the pipelines and connections to Europe, to other countries. Now, when we think in terms of energy security, this is often how we look at it. We think in terms of militarily taking over regions. Just through last week, I was engaged with a group of officers, actually from Iraq and other countries in the Middle East. And even to this day, the notion is, your objective was to control oil fields. Your objective is to secure energy. This concept of states securing energy is a critical issue. My own personal view, simply put, we need to look at the continuous availability of energy in sufficient quantities at reasonable prices. Boy, I sound like a free market guy. Well, I am. And this, in many ways, is how an American mind will think of this. We think in terms of, do we have enough? Do we have enough for our personal use, for our national use, for our military? Doesn't matter. What is energy security? Pretty straightforward. But, as some authors, and quite frankly, these are two books I would strongly recommend. One, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Yergin wrote a book called The Prize, which is the epic quest for oil, money, and power. You got to like, the subtitle, but it's about Middle East energy and how foreign companies engage there. The second one, Heinberg's book on the oil depletion protocol, tells us we've run out of oil. Peak oil is past us, and we're approaching a crisis. We're going to hear this a lot. Personally, I'm a little skeptical because I do think, actually, we'll see oil for some time. But having said that, where it is and who controls it is a problem. Because, of course, it's our good friend Russia. This is one of the new players. From a Russian perspective, from a European perspective, this is what we're looking at. And you see here just in the background his poor neighbors, one from Ukraine that pays $230 per 1,000 cubic meters, but Belarus gets to pay the low price of $46. Why does it get that low price? Because it's a closer ally. Energy prices and energy deals are based on security and national interests. This, if we're thinking in terms of how Russia is looking at energy, this is a serious question. This is a serious matter. That is the notion of how do we relate to our neighbors. Another factor, and for those of you in the back, I apologize. One, I didn't realize I'd have so many in the back. And secondly, I know the slide's probably a little lower, but this gives us some reserves. Just quick snapshot of oil reserves in the countries around the world. Saudi Arabia at almost 20% of the world's global reserves. Canada, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, of course. Russia here in position number 8, 4.6%. Now, if you think statistically, 4.6 isn't a lot. I mean, that seems a rather small number. But if you look, for example, the Department of Energy website, and if you're ever at all interested in energy questions and energy supplies, you're working on a paper, go to the Department of Energy website. They update many of the statistics on a monthly basis. Great data on American production, but also on international production. And what they show is actually 4.6 is quite good compared to countries elsewhere in the world who have much smaller percentages. And so with the reserve of over 60 billion barrels, and most likely even more, Russia is a major oil producer. Even better, it's the best gas producer. If we look at this, Russia has over 27% of the world's gas supplies. Iran has almost 16%. These two states alone, we're already looking at, 43% of the world's gas supplies. And if you think in terms of U.S. interests and who the countries we have the best relationships with, I suspect you wouldn't include Russia and Iran in that mix. Qatar, would we put that? Yeah, kind of, on a good day. Saudi Arabia, Oh, thank goodness we're number 5. We get along with ourselves okay. Nigeria, depends who's in power. Algeria. We can see the gas market's a little more difficult, and this is an area that Russia likes to play. So we think in terms of supplies. It's a global phenomenon, but obviously concentrated in the hands of a few states. I think something many of you already know. But here's something we need to underscore. If I already say that Russia is looking to energy as its way of showing power in the world, its way of regaining its stature, of regaining respect, we also have to remember that you can do that because these tend to be state-run oil companies, state-run gas companies. Now, something for an American audience we find hard to understand, because when we think of oil, and I remember last summer, we all do, right? $4 a gallon gasoline at the pump, and we're all complaining about those private companies making lots of money. In fact, oil company executives are being grilled by Congress as to why they're making so much money. We think of it in terms of private companies. We think of it in terms of individual entrepreneurs doing this or that. That's not how the world works. Most of the world looks to energy as a national resource, as something the state controls. I give here the world's largest oil and gas firms, and this is in billion barrels, and it's converted. So I converted gas to oil, so it's a collective score. And if you look at this, Saudi Aramco is number one. That, of course, is the Saudi State National Oil Company. The National Iranian Oil Company is number two. Gazprom, a Russian gas firm, is number three. The Iraqi National Oil Company is number four. And on down the line. By the way, you who have interest in Latin American, PDVSA is a Venezuelan oil company at number six. Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, Nigeria, Sonatrach is Algeria. Libya, oh goodness, Rosneft, another Russian firm. Petronas from Argentina. Finally, we get to a private company, ExxonMobil, with 20 billion barrels of reserves. 1/15 the size of Saudi Aramco, 1/12 the size of Gazprom. So we realize that state firms matter. Countries matter when it comes to their gas policy. At Gazprom, 2 of the senior executives on their board of directors are also members of the Russian cabinet. It would be as if our Department of Energy, if our head of the Department of Energy or Secretary of Energy was sitting on the board of directors at ExxonMobil. We would think, well, this can't be right. How could you? That's a conflict of interest. In most countries, that's not a conflict of interest. It's called good business. It's called doing good business because you want to promote your company. So when we think in terms of how states look at the energy market, this is a way to do it. Well, just a few last points, and I'll quickly breeze through these to get to the fun pipelines. Russia has other things to consider, and this is just some examples. There are domestic security implications. If you're an oil producer, do you have services, jobs, income distribution? Do you balance the economy? Dutch disease, which means do your exports cost more than they should? Is there corruption? Just a small indicator, again, if corruption is of interest to you, that is as a topic of study, not as a practice, I would strongly recommend looking at an organization called Transparency International. I think their website is something creative like transparency.org. TI.org, I think, gets you to like Truckers International. But Transparency International does surveys every year on perceptions of corruption in other countries. Yellow and orange are good colors. Red and dark red are not so good colors. If you were to say, where are the oil countries located? They tend to be in the red zones. You will note that Afghanistan and Somalia are whited out because it's simply too dangerous to do studies of businesses in these countries. But United States, Canada, Norway, we seem to do fairly well. But we look at Mexico, we look at Russia, we look at Kazakhstan, we look at Saudi Arabia, we look at Iraq. Corruption is pretty high. There's a direct correlation, sadly. And so when we think in terms of how we look at Russia as a security phenomena for Eurasian states, this question of corruption comes into play. And, of course, there's always this lingering fear. And if I'm a Russian decision maker, I'm always going to think, we're exporting energy. Are we going to have violence? The poster child of this, sadly, is Nigeria, a major energy exporter. But if you visit this country, you would never know. It should be a wealthy country. And, in fact, there's the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, MEND, which is a group, we can call them insurgents, some call them terrorists, and they simply go after the energy companies that they think are destroying the country. And so Russia has to think in terms as well of infrastructure security, the physical protection of its energy resources. And so it has this great wealth, it's a major player, but as it looks around the globe and sees the practices in other countries, it realizes they have domestic economic issues to contend with, they have physical protection issues to contend with. And physical protection can even be natural disasters. I do like to remind us that the biggest catastrophe in recent American energy history was this thing called Hurricane Katrina. We think of it in terms of a humanitarian disaster, which it was, human suffering, the city of New Orleans. If I'm an oil man, I look at this. I look at production facilities, I look at storage facilities, and transportation possibilities all disappearing. And so you see other countries thinking of this too. How do we address these issues, or the more dramatic ones, Iraqi pipeline routes being targeted by terrorists, and same even in the country of Mexico, where you find over 90% of Mexican exports come out of the same 6 ports. And so from the Russian perspective, they're thinking diversify your storage areas, diversify your locations, and also diversify pipeline routes, but most importantly, control them. And so I bring up these other examples from around the world to show that when state companies, and I should say countries that focus on their state companies, look at energy security, they look at a host of issues, and they look at examples around the world to see, the cost of security failure can be pretty high. If you think in terms of a hit-and-run incident, and the Russians have had great experience with this, they had pipelines going through the region of Chechnya back in the day, and traditionally Chechens would tap oil. I wouldn't recommend this for anybody, but if you were, say, short of oil, you could take a spike and a mallet and puncture a hole in the pipeline and take buckets and fill up your buckets with oil, which is what you would find happening in Chechnya. People would carve holes. They do this in Nigeria all the time. The problem is people who do this also tend to be smokers, and so you have explosions, and there's actually truth to this. And so these hit-and-run incidences can take hours or days to repair. It doesn't take much to repair a pipe. There's one in, I want to say it's in Colombia, a gas pipe, that during the height of sort of anti-state operations, FARC operations, it was getting hits average of about 300 a year. But they would fix it within a day or two, and they used to call it the flute as a nickname because it had so many holes in it. But terrorist operations, real no-kidding terrorist operations that you might see, for example, exemplified in a James Bond film or in other sort of real activities in Iraq, these could take days or weeks to repair and may cost you up to $40 to $80 million to repair. And then, of course, if you have military operations that could disable a pipeline, you're looking now at weeks or months and now hundreds of millions of dollars. Russians are familiar with this, quite frankly, when they conducted their operations against Georgia in August of 2008. They conducted 24 airstrikes on Georgian pipelines. They missed every strike. They went 0 for 24. I'm a Chicago Cubs fan, and for me that's like a normal record. But if you're a military officer, that's not good. And surprise, surprise, the commander of that wing was finding a new job shortly thereafter. They said they simply were using it to scare the Georgians. I actually think they were aiming and missed. But those sorts of things are important in the region. They realize the cost of security failure is quite high. So what are we going to do? And this really is sort of the questions to throw out and things to think about. When we look at energy security, we see this global market, we realize the threats and challenges that states face. How are we going to use it? Are we going to use our states in our foreign and security policy? And we have to think in terms of, again, we'll think Russia, Eurasian states in general, but obviously their European partners. Embargoes and production limits. Have states done this? Absolutely. Do we use energy for political concessions? No question. To hurt and punish our adversaries. I always say we need to be worried about Canada because they could punish us for something I don't know what, but they could hold oil over our head. To build partnerships, well, quite frankly, that's what we try to do. You'd like to think that in a positive way, American, Mexican, and Canadian energy links are as a way of building partnerships. OPEC is a firm way of building partnerships among certain states. Can we finance military modernizations? No question. Most of the Arab armies during the several Arab-Israeli wars were financed through oil money. This was part of the goal, was we have a resource that brings revenues into the state, we will build up our militaries. There's a conflict in the Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan, which is an oil-producing state, had a military budget of about $200 million a year. This past year, it went over $1 billion. They increased their budget fivefold. Why? Because they have oil revenues. You could also develop economic infrastructures in your country. That's a good thing. And in the end, I should say, only in Hollywood do states go to war for oil. Well, at present, we'd like to think that's the case, but when we look at our states in the region, we may see a different picture. And I just sort of note again a different way of looking at gas. I want to include our Central Asian states here, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, I should say, Caspian states, because they are part of this broader mix, a broader mix that includes these pipelines. And now you're going to get subjected to a lot of line charts. By the way, I should note, goodness, I'm now finishing my 10th year of teaching in the Defense Department, and one of the things I've learned is you cannot lecture without PowerPoints, and you need to have pictures for the audiences. And so you're sitting there, why is he going through these slides? Because it's ingrained. If the projector goes down, I'm just mute. I stand here unsure of what to say. But as long as we have pictures, we can go. This picture does tell 1,000. This picture does, it's sort of 1,000 words, because in many ways, it's the central question you need to look at. We've painted this big picture of Russian interest and the problems of energy producers and the challenges they may face. Ultimately, this is what we're looking at. This is what we're looking at. It's a routing of various options for Caspian oil and arguably for Russian oil to get to international markets. Those of you with excellent vision, I'm not one of them, but if you would see here, there's existing Russian pipeline, planned, and then almost everything has the word proposed. Important to note, because these pipelines are fictitious. These pipelines are hopes. Pipeline routes through Iran. In the 90s, I had the good fortune of working on a project with Unocal where we were, I should say I was consulting for them. They were trying to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. You can use the phrase, it seemed like a good idea at the time. We realized in 1998, after this organization called Al-Qaeda became rather prominent in Afghanistan, it was not a good idea to build an American pipeline through that country. Hamid Karzai, by the way, is requesting it resurface. He wants a pipeline through the region. Interesting option. American companies aren't biting. It's going to probably be the Argentinian company, Bridas, is most interested. So you have different options here of routes. The question then is, where do you go? Which options do you take? If you're Russia, and if you understand that security means controlling your routes, means protecting the pipelines, it means having control of the infrastructure, of the processing, of the end state terminals, you name it, you need to look at things that are short, direct, cross over as few countries as possible, and go to countries that you have greater trust or faith in. That's a tall order. We'd like to think we can do that. Other countries try to do that, of course. Very hard to do. The Russian strategy, very simply, has been to build pipelines into Europe, potentially bypassing some of the East European states, going through Ukraine. And as we know, twice in the last 3 years, pipelines from Russia through Ukraine have been cut off, most recently as January 1st of this year, where they simply said, you're not paying the right bills, we're going to shut off the shipment. That, of course, doesn't just punish Ukraine, it punishes all the other states nearby, the states to which the gas eventually goes to, Serbia, Hungary, Croatia, you name it. So you find that it can be used as a weapon, it can be used to pressure states, but again, the goal is to try to control as much. And not even just your own energy, and this is why I bring up this map. If you have Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, two very important countries in the oil and gas sectors respectively, you're Russia, you want to make sure their energy goes through your country, that the routes go through your state, onward to Europe, onward to Turkey. There was a route possibility of having Turkmen gas go through Iran to the Caucasus and onward to Turkey, you name it. The U.S. even sanctioned it. We said, yeah, it violates the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. At the time, it was still Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. But we thought it was so beneficial for Turkmenistan to diversify its energy, to move away from Russian control, that it was worth it, even if Iran gets a little bit. The problem is the Turkmen president at the time, Saparmurad Niyazov, wasn't a very good negotiator. He sort of thought people needed to raise the price high enough. He failed to come to terms with Turkey. Keeps failing to come to terms with Turkey until a month after a great discovery in Azerbaijan of gas reserves, to which Turkey said, why go through all this hassle when we can go to Azerbaijan, which is almost a neighbor? So they go get Azerbaijani gas and leave Turkmenistan out in the cold. Turkmenistan has no choice but to go through Russia. In fact, to date, all of Turkmen gas goes through Russia. Most of Kazakh oil goes through Russia. We see some Kazakh oil across the Caspian. We see some will soon go to China. But Russia feels that it must control these states. Why? Because some things are simple as because they can dictate policy, because they can show they're the major player in the region. But also, this really is the card that they feel they can play in European and Eurasian politics, the energy card. Because when we look more broadly at routes going through Europe, we realize that we have other options from North Africa, liquefied natural gas terminals being put in France and in Belgium and UK. The possibility of diversifying is out there, but many of these options are looking at 5-10 years down the road. If I'm smart, if I'm Russia, if I'm Alexei Miller, if I'm Vladimir Putin, even if I'm good President Medvedev, I'm thinking I need to strike my deals first because I need to solidify contracts going 5, 10, 15 years out. And so what we find is Russia using this in a way that those of you who study international relations and how to deal with other states, either in a good way or in a not so good way, realize that Russia tends to the latter. They tend to use energy for power, as we've been noting, as leverage. Now, I gave the example of them cutting the gas shipments through Ukraine. And they've done this several times. They've done this to Georgia. They've threatened other states. Moldova has had energy cut off. You can almost go down the list of all the neighbors, and they have all, at some point in the last 5 years, faced an energy issue with Russia. Now, why would they do this? Part of it is an economic logic. If we think in terms of how they're going through this, part of it's an economic logic. They're thinking in terms of, in the old Soviet days, we charged a discounted rate. We didn't get the money we deserved from transiting oil or gas through our state. Now we're simply charging market rates, European rates, if you will. There's a political logic. We are sovereign states. We have an access that you need. Deal with it. You have resources. You need to get them to market. But the political consequences almost of where your geography is, where you're located, requires you work with us. Plus, you know us. You've worked with Russia for many, many years. But of course, there are consequences. Immediately after the first time shipments were cut off to Ukraine, the European Union got together and negotiated a common strategy. Interesting. The common strategy suggested they negotiate again and look forward to a common strategy. They really didn't come up with one except to say Russia's important, we need to include them. This doesn't get sort of more seriously treated until a few years later. Because what you find are some countries, if we think in terms of these routes, are going to take advantage of them. Germany, for example, with the pipeline going through the Baltic. Turkey is taking advantage of gas routes from Russia across the Black Sea. And we even see China now taking advantage of direct routes as well. China's very keen on the same logic. That is, we want to control beginning to end. We would like to have pipelines from Russia, from Kazakhstan, going into our country, particularly as this is now one of the major consumers of oil and gas in the world. That is, if we look at the change year on year, China's the fastest growing consumer. So we see these Russian routes going in specific ways. Just one last one to look at is the Baltic pipeline route. Those of you who are students of history and of military history, the Polish foreign minister once called this the Molotov-Ribbentrop pipeline, hearkening back to the Second World War, where you have a direct route from Russia to Germany. Now, our good friends in Finland and Sweden are upset about this for ecological reasons, but nobody's listening. It didn't help that the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, after he stepped down from office, immediately became a consultant for Gazprom, the Russian energy firm. Actually, I asked about this in the American context. Would this be seen as a sort of not just bad business, but illegal? And it actually depends on your position, and it depends on what his payments are. It may even be legal. Is it ethical? Absolutely not. And in the German case, surprise, surprise, German citizens actually reacted poorly to this. He was a somewhat popular chancellor, even with some strident anti-Americanism that those of us who were Americans living in Germany didn't care for. Among Germans, fairly popular until this happened, and then they realized, not a good thing. But it's one more route in which Russia is trying to bypass. And what we see after this is simply a history of alternatives, of ways in which we can bypass the Russian stranglehold. One example is what we call the Nabucco gas pipeline that would get Iranian and Azeri gas to Europe. Now, if you're comfortable working with Iranians, the American option has Iran less active and more on Azerbaijan. We have it go through Turkey, we have it go through Bulgaria, Romania, all the way to Austria, where it then branches off even into further countries. But these are the major players in this pipeline. Completely bypasses Russia. If you're Moscow and you see this pipeline being built, what do? You put up alternatives. You build pipelines to each specific country. You create deals with Romania. You create deals with Hungary. You create deals with Slovakia. And suddenly you tell them, Nabucco's not really a good option, is it? We have a better route here. Yeah, it's a better route. It's cheaper. We'll pay for it. We'll pay for it. Trust us. And so we're finding, quite frankly, a big battle taking place. Last year, energy experts would have told you Nabucco is dead. This year, I hear it has a pulse. It may be alive again. It's one of the many battles that are taking place. And like it or not, and this is perhaps where Russia has overplayed its hand on cutting off energy, it's seen as a pro-Russia, anti-Russia move. I mean, we're back, for those of you who think in terms of idealism and realpolitik, this is realpolitik, except we're now talking about energy, not militaries. I mentioned this one option on Baku-Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline route. This one was a U.S.-backed program. It was funded. It exists. By the way, the same month that Russia attempted to bomb aspects of it in Georgia, the PKK bombed a section of the pipeline in Turkey. There's a domestic issue here as well. And so this is a route that has come to fruition, so to speak. It's one that has clear benefits for the parties involved, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Georgia, the consumers in the Mediterranean, who could be anyone from Spain to Italy to Israel. Policy benefits clearly benefited the U.S. U.S. advocates for this route were strong in the mid-'90s until it was completed. Yes, we saw it as anti-Russian. There's no question. But our goal was not necessarily we want this pipeline because it's against Russia. Rather, we want this pipeline because Azerbaijan has an alternative to Russia. Move it around. But rhetorically, it obviously can be viewed or received in a different way, and Russia viewed it more in the negative way. Is it pro-Turkish? Absolutely. Turkey's a big ally of the U.S. This helps us. One last thing I just say on the bottom. Is it anti-Armenian? Believe it or not, the U.S. Congress actually proposed that we have a possible way to bypass or go through Armenia, to pass through Armenia. That didn't happen. To an extent, sadly, because of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, this was somewhat anti-Armenian. The Armenian groups in Washington that I deal with or see put this up as, you created a pipeline that was not good for our country, so don't complain when we have pipelines from Iran. It's like, okay. But that's probably one of the negative aspects of this route. But by and large, I've already noted this as far as there have been attacks on it. By and large, it's been seen as one way in which to circumvent Russian control. And then just lastly, a few other options. We have our Russian opportunities, but we also have routes through Europe, through Central Europe, through Turkey. One of my favorite, any of you who are interested in or experts in the southern Balkan region, or should I say Southeast Europe, Balkan, we try not to use it as much anymore. It's the route from Bulgaria to Macedonia to Albania, AMBO. I loved this group because back in the 90s, they set up a small lobbying firm in Washington. And they would get invited to all the energy events, I think because people felt sorry for them. It's like, here's this Albanian energy expert, probably the only one, who was doggedly going to these meetings, learning about the business, making contacts. And everyone said, this was the moment where if you needed comic relief, you would raise the AMBO pipeline, because who would want to build a pipeline across Macedonia and Albania? Well, the Italians did, and other countries did. And what we have now is a pipeline that's going to be opened through a lot of effort, determination. A very small route, but one from Burgas, Bulgaria, all the way to Vlore is being built, I should say, and it will take oil and gas from Georgia, from Supsa, a small terminal there, across the Black Sea, bypassing the Bosporus in Istanbul, finding a new market. These sorts of options we're seeing out. In Constanța, I had the good chance to visit the terminal in Constanța itself to see where the Romanians want to build a pipeline to bypass Russia. So we're looking at options. These were raised in the early part of this decade. Quite frankly, it's 2009. They're being seriously considered. Oh, and one last thing, just one last point, because this is, after all, in a broad context, Eurasia, Asia, I should say, and in fact, in honor of my colleagues to the east, I wore my tie from a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Beijing with little pandas on it. The Chinese are the big player. They want to be the big player. They look at the squabbles going on amongst the Russians and Europeans, and they do see Russians and Europeans, quite frankly, as the same. Those people. They see these opportunities in the region writ large. Kazakhstan, Iran, Central, you name it, pipelines everywhere. At the end of the day, is this the market of the 21st century? Are we looking at routes going this way? Now, there's just a small one here, and you're thinking, we go through the Taklamakan Desert, we're going to eventually find our way here to the east, but it's pretty modest. It's modest now. But they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in studies and in preliminary work and in purchasing pipeline options in Kazakhstan. So as we look at different routes in the future, I'd go this way as well. Actually, what I'd like to do is pause right here because there's a lot more I could go through. And in fact, let me see if I can go right to the end, because these are just little energy routes we have, because I like my little fish tank with the gas, and we have, if those of you who are good with flags can figure out which countries are represented. But we have, energy policy at the end does have a security component. It can be a source of conflict. And the question we have to ask, and what I really haven't raised, but be happy to talk about further, is these options are ultimately multilateral. And so when you look at which route is being built, and if you look at studies of energy politics, constantly ask the question, what's in it for that country? Why is Russia acting a certain way? Why is Serbia acting a certain way? Why is Germany acting a certain way? Think in terms of these perspectives, and I think this will give us a better clue as to how they ultimately solve this Russian energy conundrum. Anyway, with that now, I'd be happy to answer any and all questions. I know some have to get up and go to class or other issues, but be happy to answer. Yeah.
Do people actually feel threatened at all by alternative energy resources? Is that a problem?
Good question. Alternative energy resources. Do people feel threatened in the sense of moving away from oil gas? Exactly. We can take the French model, which was 1973 oil crisis. What did the U.S. do? We diversified our pipeline routes. What did France do? They built 58 nuclear power plants. To date, they've had 0 accidents. Now, we think in terms of 3 Mile Island. I think also in terms of Chernobyl. But nuclear energy is relatively safe. You see this in Armenia, there's a nuclear power plant. Ukraine is looking at the possibility of nuclear power plants. And, of course, we have that wonderfully transparent example of Iran looking at nuclear power plants. But I would say that in the region, you see some move in that direction. Finland is building one. But some of the big countries, Germany, for example, you've got to be kidding. There is no interest. The anti-nuclear movement is so high. Other alternatives, wind, solar, etc., that's coming up. Greece, I know, is putting in their energy laws something to the effect that at the end of a decade, 20% of their energy will come from alternative sources. I mean, solar power in Greece, I think, is a no-brainer. But they have to bureaucratically set it up, which actually that could take 10 years. But you do see other options moving outside of oil and gas, because I think this last round of Russian cutoffs scared people. Absolutely. Other questions or concerns? Yes?
How long does it take to build some of these pipelines? Are we talking about a decade of work? Or?
Real, no kidding, building the route. First of all, you have to have an initial bid. For example, Baku-Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline had a bidding process where each company had to put in $500 million non-refundable bids, $500 million non-refundable bids. Then the president deliberated. I think he spent some of it, and decided, British Petroleum, they'll be the good guys. And then they had to do all sorts of site surveys. That could take years. The actual construction, when ground is first broken to completion, 1,500-kilometer pipeline route will probably take 2 years. I mean, it's not a long time. Having said that, Baku-Tbilisi Ceyhan took about 8. Because some of this was negotiations, renegotiations, things broke down. You'd find protests. The pipeline was going over a mineral water reservoir, and so they wanted to alter it. So you had different things like that. And some countries are better than others about what do you do if there's a village in the way? Some countries don't have a problem with that. Other countries actually take the local community into question, and that becomes a legal issue. So the actual process itself isn't much. The challenging ones are the routes to China, because there you may be looking at upwards of 4,000-kilometer pipeline routes, which this is the country that gave us the Great Wall. They might as well give us the Great Pipeline. To do it requires pumping stations that, quite frankly, the technology for which, I should say, is really now coming about. Firms love it. I mean, energy guys are like, oh, this is great stuff, because they're building and expanding. But that could take easily 5-8 years. The advantage China has, labor is cheap. They don't really pay much. But yeah, it can be a long process. I think we had some questions in the back. Yeah.
You brought up the very transparent Iran nuclear power plant that's being, and Russia's kind of in on that.
Yeah.
Do you think that anything with this energy policy is related to Russia's involvement, or why do you think Russia's involved in creating a nuclear?
This is simply my own armchair view of the situation. Russia got into a game that they don't understand now. That is, when they wanted to support the Bushehr plant, the original nuclear power plant, they were supportive of it. They gave the technical assistance. They acknowledged it. They said, this is what we're doing. It was a financial transaction. Iran was giving them things on the cheap. It worked out well for both parties. My personal opinion, Russia does not want to see a nuclear Iran, that is, nuclear weaponized Iran. It serves them no value. In fact, if anything, it challenges them. As recently as 1946, Russia occupied parts of Iran. They've not had the best of relations. We think today that they do, but in the Iranian mindset, Russia's a country of infidels at the end of the day. That we can do business with them, but it's short-term business and for our gain. And so several years back, Russia, when they offered the possibility of saying, Iran can build the nuclear plants and we will monitor and store the fissile material, the used material, Iran rejected it. So this isn't Iran rejecting the U.S. or France or Britain, which one would expect, but they actually are rejecting Iran. And right now, and as I follow like Shanghai Cooperation Organization discussions on this issue, the Russians and Chinese, they don't like it. And so what you find is Russia doesn't want to punish Iran. This is the one issue. Because to punish Iran means they have to bandwagon with the U.S. Can't do that. But you don't want a nuclear Iran because it's not good for regional security. It hurts your presence in the Caucasus and in Central Asia, and quite frankly, weakens your presence in the broader Middle East. So what do? I mean, they almost just want to close their eyes and wish this to go away, hope that the French, the French and the British or the Germans somehow solve this problem. If the Americans solve it, I think the Americans under the current administration solving it would be less offensive than the past one because of their visceral hatred for Bush. I think now they just don't like Obama, which is a step up in levels of hatred. I think to have had a success on this issue in the last administration is something Russia wouldn't have tolerated. Maybe they'll take it now, but they'll spin it a whatever way, a certain way. But no, this has been an issue, and they're not happy with it. Not at all. Okay. Yes.
When we were talking about China being the future energy market,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that is from a realpolitik perspective, do you think that's a positive in taking power away from Russia and not giving them the nozzle to shut it off, or do you think that that's another dangerous seeing them as a strategic competitor?
Good question. That is a good question. To be honest, it's a competitor. And in fact, in Chinese discussions of regional security matters and energy security, they see Russia as a supplier of raw materials to them. And if you think about it, when we think in terms of the U.S. and our partners, and we have some countries we trade with commercial goods and other countries for raw materials, you have a certain mindset. A country that gives you, German high-precision optics or Japanese high-precision electronics, we think of these as advanced societies, advanced economies. People that give us cocoa beans and oil, we think of as, well, okay, they're giving us the low stuff. That's how China views Russia. They view Russia as a has-been nation, as a country that has seen better days, that they are, in fact, in Eurasia broadly, China is in ascendancy. I've seen in Central Asia, it's amazing, of the 5 Central Asian states that Russia claims this is their backyard, their domain, the largest embassy in staff, and here's the little trivial pursuit answer, in square footage of embassies, it's China. They want to show that they're the big presence. So in all of this, when they look at the oil battles going on, they feel, yes, we need Russian energy, but Russia needs us too for finished products, for other goods, and they're going to need this relationship, this trade between Russia and China more than they will even with the Europeans. I used to be a much stronger advocate of the European routes, and I used to think the Chinese route was kind of pie in the sky, not really going to happen. I've changed my mind on that one. It really has moved in that direction because China has become much more aggressive. The flip side, this baffles Russia, to be blunt. They haven't had the cadre of China experts that they used to. I think they still view China in this Maoist era world. They don't accept the new China the way that it is, and this is going to cause them problems. And in fact, from a public opinion point of view, they have this deep-seated and almost irrational fear of Chinese crossing the border and populating Siberia and the Far East, and they can't stop it. And so you have these strange stereotypes and perceptions, mostly out of simply not knowing.
From an American,
Yeah.
Even if China is this competitor with us, from an American perspective, isn't it better to have 2 competitors fighting each other over the same thing as opposed to one competitor controlling that?
Yep, and then what we'd have to say is, I guess Henry Kissinger was right. It is all about, if you think in terms of the old days of the 3 big powers, 2 are always going to be fighting, and thank goodness it's those other 2, not us. You want them to fight it over, not one of them with you. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Any other last questions? Yes.
Just a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of talk about our dependency on foreign oil. How much, if we were to tap into all of the reserves and everything available, within our own grasp, how much would that affect our dependency? Is it too marginal to even, take into account, or is it significant enough?
On the and I actually didn't put these up, but U.S. statistics, we get it's actually exactly 66% of our oil from foreign sources, 34% from U.S. sources. Of the 34%, the big ones are offshore, Texas, California, Alaska. In fact, we get more oil from California than Iraq, so I always like to say Arnold Schwarzenegger is more important than Maliki. Louisiana, these are our big producers. The foreign sources, actually the two of the top three are Mexico and Canada. Saudi is number 2. It's Canada, Saudi, Mexico, on down. And so, and of course we have Venezuela in there, which is an interesting issue. And so when we look at dependence on foreign oil, to move that number lower, which it hasn't gone lower in years. In fact, it's only gone up. Exploring the reserves, for example, in the zone up in Alaska on the Canadian border of offshore, even my state has now authorized offshore drilling in Virginia. We think we have 6 barrels of oil. I'm not sure. Some states have more, and this is the mystery. I would say when the price went up to $147 a barrel, it was feasible to go to these very, I should say, less accessible areas. Believe it or not, there are ways in which one can drill in an environmentally safe way. This is a hotly debated issue. However, as you start to cheapen the price, you cheapen the exploration, that's when you run into trouble. When we're down now at $35, $39 a barrel, it's not feasible to go to these other sources. They're simply too expensive. To get it out of the ground is going to take a long time, take a lot of money. And so at present, it's probably not feasible. If you're looking at a margin, it may increase it by 2 or 3%, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because in the energy realm, again, small percentages matter. The other thing, though, would be, we get flooded with these ads in the D.C. radio system. I suspect you may as well, the T. Boone Pickens, alternative sources, wind power and other things like that. Believe it or not, even if you upped that to, say, 10%, right now it's at 2, alternative fuels. But if you up that to 10% for U.S. energy, that would make a huge difference. And, in fact, that would make an even bigger difference. Because I do agree. If you look at energy dependency, I mentioned, this Russian notion of wanting control of things or the Chinese notion of wanting control. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We've had a system of dependency on multiple sources, multiple routes. Some have shut down, some have opened up. Iran used to be a major importer, or a major exporter, I should say. By domesticating it, by putting it more Western Hemisphere, which has been our strategy, it's safe. It makes it safer. Alternative options in the U.S. Price gets up to about 50, 60. You'll see it come up again. But yeah, kind of a longer answer to your shorter question. But no, it's a great question, and that's without question one of the biggest ones that Americans face, which is how do we deal with these foreign sources? Because again, if you look at all these options, they're not the safest, most stable places. We have Texas, which sometimes I wonder if that's safe and stable, but no, it is. Those of you from Texas, I apologize. Anyway, any last words, questions? Or I think we can get it. Well, thank you so much for your time, attention.